Hello and welcome back. With our game window created and our main game loop running, let's now discuss adding some game assets to our game. We will utilize object-oriented programming to help us keep track of everything within our game. So for this tutorial, I'll have two classes, a player class that the user can control, and a game class that will help oversee kind of like the functionality of the game. So let's go outline those classes and their methods right now. So I'm going to come here and right above my main game loop, I'll just put a comment. I'll say create classes. So we'll have a player class, so class player, and we'll just put a little doc string, a player class the user can control. All right, perfect. And so let's just put a couple of methods in here. We're going to keep it really simple. So we need an initialization method. So def underscore underscore init underscore underscore. And let's talk about some of the parameters we have to have here. You always have to pass the self parameter. And then here, when we initialize a player, we're going to pass an x coordinate and a y coordinate. Its starting positions. We'll pass a size, so how big do we want the player object to be? And we'll pass a color. What color do we want the player to be? So sometimes, we can have sprites as our player, so we could actually have like image assets. But for this tutorial and for the multiplayer game that we're going to make, we're not going to use any sprites. We're just going to use colored rectangles, just for the ease of these videos. So we'll just put a little comment here, initialization of the player class. And we'll pass for right now. And then the player class should also have an update method. So we'll say def update. We'll pass the self parameter. It will not need anything else here. And this is going to just simply update the player by changing their coordinates in the game window. So maybe, when a user presses a key and wants to move the player, we got to update the player's x, y coordinates that we initialize right here. Okay, and we're going to keep this really simple in this tutorial, so that's going to be it for our player class. So let's now go write the signature for our game class. So say class game, and we'll put here a class to control gameplay. Now, this one will be maybe a little bit more involved, but not too bad. We'll, again, need an initialization method, so we'll say def underscore underscore init underscore underscore. We'll pass in the self parameter, and then what other things do we want our game to have? Well, we're going to create a player class that the user can control. I definitely want my game to have access to that player, so we're going to access or give them a player attribute. And so we'll just say here initialization for the game class, and we'll pass for right now. We'll set that all up at a later time. What else do we want? Well, we're going to want an update method, so we can update the game. We'll pass self, and we don't really need anything else in here, but what are some gameplay features for our game? Well, we are going to have a timer that is going to count down how long like an arbitrary round is. So we're going to say this should update the game by advancing we'll say advance the clock. And we're also going to, we have access to our player, we will ensure the player gets updated as well. So the player's got an update method right here. We're going to make sure that that update method gets called. So we'll also update the player. All right, but for right now, of course, we're just blueprinting this out. We'll say pass. And then lastly, we're going to put one more method in here to keep it simple. We'll say def draw. So we're going to have a draw method for the game because the game is going to have things like the timer and our clock. It also has access to our player object. We need to make sure that we are drawing these things like our time, our score, all these things, maybe our player, to the surface every iteration of our game loop. So we'll call this draw method. So we'll say draw the game and game assets to the game window. And for right now, we will just pass. Okay, wonderful. So now that we have our classes outlined, let's go create some instances of these classes to use inside of our main game loop. So I'm going to come right down here, right outside of our main game loop. We'll create these instances, and I will, we'll see, create a player and game class. So I'll call my player, and it's going to be a player object. And when we initialize the player, what did we say we needed? We needed a starting x and y coordinate, a size, and a color. Okay, so I'll just pick some values. I'll do 0 and 0. We'll start right in the left-hand corner of our game window. The size will be 25, and then the color, I have defined a player color here that I've chosen. So I'll just use player color. So we'll say all capitals player underscore color. Wonderful. Now that we have a player object, let's create a game object. We'll call it my game, and it'll be a game object. And what does a game need to be initialized? Well, it needs access to a player. And we've just created one, so this works out perfect. We'll pass in my player in here. Wonderful, wonderful. So now we have our game and player objects. So if we think about it, inside of our main game loop, what's something that we're definitely going to want to do? Well, our game has an update method where we want to do things like advance the clock and update the player's position. And then we have a draw method where we want to draw all the assets to the screen. These seem like great things that we should do inside of our main game loop. So if we scroll down here, here is our main game loop. Where do we want to do them? Well, if you remember, we said the first thing that we should do is we should just fill in our surface. So we'll make our surface completely black. And once it's black, or whatever color we choose, then we will do the things such as updating and drawing on top of that surface. So we'll say update and draw classes. So we'll call mygame.update. We'll call the update method of the game object, and then we'll call mygame.draw. We'll call the draw method of our game class. All right, wonderful. So with these being called now inside of our main game loop, if I run this, nothing's going to happen. We haven't written any of these methods yet, so why don't we go write some of these methods for our game class? So I'll scroll up here to my game class, and let's start with the initialization method. If we look here, we're taking in a player object that we are creating, so let's attach it as an attribute to the game class. So we'll say self, all right, self.player is equal to player. So whatever player we pass in, we're taking that and we are setting it as an attribute to this instance of a game class, and that's what that self keyword means there. Now let's create variables to hold the state of the current game. Okay, so here, if we think, we want to hold some variables that are help us with gameplay. In particular, I want a countdown timer. So a game's going to start, I don't know, it'll say 60, then 59, then 58, and 57. I can count backwards. And so to do this, we need a couple of different things here, and we'll discuss why in a moment. We're going to have a frame count variable to help us figure out how long a second actually is. And then we're going to use a variable called we'll call round time, and that'll keep track of the actual round time for a given round. So we'll say self.frame count, and we'll initialize this to be a value of 0. We'll just say help determine how long 1 second is, and then we'll do self.round time is equal to whatever, we'll initialize it to its starting value to whatever we set the round time variable to be up here. So I'll say, here we go, round time, and this will be current round time. So it'll count down, right? So it'll start at 25, but then this will go on to be like 24, then 23, then 22. And if we make a new game when it's initialized, we'll always start at 25. Perfect. So let's move on to our update method. Our update method is going to do two things. It will update our countdown timer that we want, and it will update the player. So we'll start with the timer. So we'll say advance the in-game timer. Now, this is important to note. We are calling this update method of our game object every iteration of our main game loop. Now, every iteration of our main game loop will not be 1 second. All right, it's not going to take 1 second for this game loop to run. So what we need to do is, or essentially, what we can't do, we can't change our round time variable right here. I can't say self.round time if I want to do a countdown. I can't just do -=1. It will go way, way, way too fast. So what we can do is we can use our frames per second variable is going to help us determine that we are going to run 30 loops every 1 second. So we set FPS to be 30, so that means 30 loops of our main game loop will run in 1 second. If I change this to 60, well, that means 60 loops are going to run in 1 second. So I just have it set to 30. So we can use that fact to help us here. So let's see how. I'm going to get rid of this. We're going to start by advancing our frame count variable every iteration of the game loop. You see we've got a frame count here that's equal to 0. So the first time the loop runs, self.frame_count, we will add 1 to it. So it'll be 1. The next time it'll be 2. The next time it'll be 3. The next time it'll be 4. And when frame count gets to a value of 30, which is what our FPS variable is equal to, we will know 1 second has passed. And when that has happened, now we can change our round time variable. And so this is a great application of modulo division. So we'll say if self.frameCount modulo the FPS variable is equal to 0, then that means we have hit 30 seconds or something divisible by 30. Well, in our case, it's going to be 30 because it's the first divisible number. Now we know 1 second has passed, so we can say self.roundTime minus equals 1. We can decrement it by 1. And what we'll do is we'll reset the frame count variable back to 0. So we'll say self.frameCount is equal to 0. All right, perfect. So that's going to update our timer for us. And now we want to update the player in here. So we'll also say update the player. And so to update the player, we have access to the player. And the player is going to have its own update method. So we'll just simply call that method. So we'll say self.player.update. All right, wonderful. The last thing that we'll do here is we'll do the draw method for the game class. Here we'll start by, well, essentially, we got to draw our player and we got to draw our timer. Those are the two things that we have here in this tutorial game. So we'll start by drawing the player. So we'll say draw the player, and we're just going to use rectangles, right? Now we could use sprites or images, but we'll simplify this by just using recs or rectangles here. In Pygame we call them recs. So I'll say pygame.draw.rect. And so this is going to draw us a rectangle, and now we have to give some information here. First, we have to say to what surface do you want to draw this rectangle? We want to draw it to the display surface that we've created. Then we have to say what color we want it to be drawn. So I'll just, for right now, I'll hard code some information here. I'll say player color. And then lastly, we have to give some coordinates as to where we want to draw this rectangle. Now, eventually, we'll get the coordinates from our player object, but for right now we don't have a player object, so I'm just going to hard code this. I'll say as a tuple 0, 0, and then we'll do that's the starting x, the starting y, and then the ending x will be 25, and the ending y will be 25. So I'm just hard coding these right now, but eventually what we'll do is we'll get them from the player. All right, perfect. So now that that's done, that'll draw our player. Let's create the round time text and draw. Now, we're going to render text. Now, rendering text is kind of a multi-step process. First, we're going to render a text object using the font that we had previously defined. Then we'll get a rect, or a rectangle, that outlines that text object. And we can use that rect to position the text exactly where we want it. And once we have that, we will blit, or copy, both the text object and the text rect. So that will put the text exactly where we want it. So we'll start by saying time text is equal to our font object, which we called font, and we're going to call the render method. And here we'll pass a string. It'll say time, and then we'll do plus. Can I use an f string here? I wonder if I can use an f string. I don't know if we can. We'll try it. So we'll say we'll use an f string. We'll say time, and then we'll do self.roundTime. So whatever the current time is, that's it stored in our round. Ooh, better change that to round. There we go, round time variable. All right, perfect. Next, we're going to just set a Boolean here to true. I believe that's for anti-aliasing. And then we're going to specify a text color. And so we'll specify white. Now that we've created a text object, we're going to get a rectangle that surrounds that text object. So I'll say time rect is equal to time text dot get underscore rect. So we're going to get the rectangle that surrounds the time text object. Now that I have that rectangle, I can move that rectangle. So I'm going to say time rect dot center. I'm going to position it using the center attribute, and I'm going to center it in the x position right in the middle of our window. So window underscore width divided by 2, and I'll use floor division so I get an integer here. And then the y value, I'll do 15. So the y coordinates, 0 is at the top, and it increases as you go down. So 15 would be like, this is 0. 15 will put us like right here. Now that I have the rect exactly where we want it, what we will do is we will blit or copy our objects to our display surface. So display surface dot blit. And here we have to specify what object do we want to blit or copy, time text, and where do we want to blit or copy it, at the time rect. Okay, I think this is going to work pretty nicely. So our 3 game methods are done. So if I run this right now, we're going to create a player object, we're going to create our game object, and we're updating the game and drawing the game in every iteration of the game loop. Now, we've hard-coded drawing a player. Eventually, we'll get this information from our player object, but let's see what happens. And we have an error. So it says Pygame object has no attribute center. So I spelled center wrong right here. Yep, I spelled it setner. So center. There we go. So I'll change that, and if we run this, this should work out quite nicely. So we get our rect right here. It's that purple color, and you can see our time is updating. So the update method, the draw method of our game object is working great. Next, what we should work on is the player class, so that maybe the player can move when we maybe press a key, and then when our game class updates the player, we will see him move in real time. So that is a great place to stop here, and we'll begin working on that in our next video. I'll see you then.